Close everything that's taking up any memory. Okay, I think this is working. All right. So the idea behind this was Urbit's supposed to be a collective in that close everything. What matters is who owns it and what they do with it. But unless you're booting an Urbit right now, you don't necessarily know who works on this thing. So the least we can do is talk to people who work at Tlon, all of whom I think are fascinating. So the idea is just to bring everybody on one by one and talk to them about how they ended up working on this thing, because the variety of those stories is pretty wild. Last time we talked to Pop Rocks, which is tough to beat, but the reality is I don't know as much as I should about Nick, who's here today. So what's the story, man? I met you at an Urbit meetup. So that tends to be, our normal recruiting tool is that we just recruit people who somehow find their way into this thing. And we were just talking about the fact that, yeah, the self-serving reason for doing this is that I actually want to know more about the people who work here because it's a little embarrassing in some cases how little I do know, besides the fact that you can contribute something really valuable and like we like working together, right? But anyway, yeah, we met at an Urbit meetup, and so I'm curious what, I think at that point you're working on foundation stuff, but of some kind, but maybe you want to wind the clock back even further. You can start wherever you want. Normally, I feel like I'm just like, where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? But I don't know. Start wherever you want to start.
Well, now I'm curious what percentage of Tlon employees just wandered into a meetup, right?
It's actually really high.
That actually
uh,
doesn't surprise me.
that's a good question. I mean, there was when we first grew, it was like there was only one person I think who was not a contributor, or one or two maybe. I mean, even now, like wasn't a contributor like active in the open source community before they started working here. Uh, and even now, I think that number is like three out of whatever, 20, 22. So, uh, yeah,
So actually, the way I found my way to Urbit and Tlon does have to do with foundation stuff, and it began with an offhand comment to several people that I was curious about whether anyone was doing foundation stuff that didn't suck. And so I have somewhat of a background in nonprofit administration and community institutions, community activism, that kind of stuff. And I was pretty unhappy with the state of a lot of it. And so I had moved to the Bay about 2 or 3 years before this. I'm probably the only person in the world that ever moves to the Bay Area to get like peace and quiet. But I was working on a science fiction novel, and I wanted to go somewhere with nicer weather and that I didn't, know as many people, and I didn't have as many demands of my time. And so I was working on that, but then I got to reflecting on like, is there really any possible way to like, avoid some of these pitfalls in like running, community institutions? Because I think that stuff is really important, and it's like the backbone of distributed civilization and so forth. And but the problems that I had run into were really severe, and so I just started kind of like actively musing about this to several people, and one of them said, "Well, Urbit's trying to start a foundation, and if you have experience, you should go talk to them." And so I came to the meetup.
got it. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That was the context, which then obviously that, like the context for what you do changed and that our plans for that change, which we could get into, but let's go back further. So how does this sort of like community organizations matter sort of seed get planted, right? Like that's not something you study in school. Uh,
No, no.
yeah.
Uh, In fact, I couldn't really tell you where it comes from. Honestly, I think that I grew up in the countryside, and I always felt like, there's a world out there, and so there's just kind of building, up and up and up, and then I spent 2 years in boarding school in high school, and that was, in some ways, this great community that's all around you all the time, and in other ways, it was like profoundly cut off from the world. I mean, this is like
Yeah.
middle of nowhere, like northern Michigan.
Yeah.
Uh,
Were you actually in the
so.
UP or just Northern Michigan?
Almost,
Yeah.
almost. Interlaken, so it's about an hour south of the bridge.
Oh, wait, have you and Karina talked about this?
Oh no,
Karina went to Interlochen too.
no way.
Yeah,
That's
it's cool.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
so
mean,
after
Interlochen's like a
that,
special place. Like that's not
yeah.
just some random, from my understanding. And I knew a couple other actually. So Karina, who also works here for anyone watching, right, who has no idea what we're talking about, is an old friend of mine from my first round of college. And at that point, there were other people there who had also gone to Interlochen. Anyway, I've met a bunch of Interlochen people. Like Interlochen seems interesting.
Oh yeah, no, that's. I mean, we could talk about that for hours.
Yeah,
I
I bet.
on a darker note, it just recently came out the whole story of Jeffrey Epstein and Interlaken because they gave him
What?
his own cap. Oh yeah, they gave. So he's an alum of the camp, and they gave
Huh.
him his own cabin in sometime 10 years ago or whatever, and so he would show up a few times, and there are cases of him trying to like groom Interlochen alums through like the alumni network,
Wow.
and they're super
Uh,
embarrassed about it now. Like there goes
well,
there
yeah,
goes any chance of
understandably
my
so.
there goes any chance of my going back there or working there or anything like that. But there, yeah, that place
Uh,
has some issues.
well, I mean, I think I just think of it as like one of these. you don't realize it when you're a kid, but there aren't that many institutions like that that become
Yeah.
the sort of funnels in that way. So, well, so was it something about like did you come out of Interlochen like thinking about the actual governance of Interlochen? I mean, I feel like
Oh
I went to
no.
sort of a weird high school and definitely had like plenty of things about the school itself, which I think like were impactful in both like in terms of me thinking, oh, they're doing some things right, and then there's some things I completely hate that have to change. It's like could be motivating, but maybe no, this is not. You're like, yeah, it was fine, whatever.
I mean, it had its ups and downs, but my main emotion coming out of there was like I want to go like actually interact with the world. Like I was
Yeah,
ready
yeah,
to like
yeah,
live in a
yeah.
city and
I had
like
the same exact like tiny school in the middle of nowhere in the countryside, and then you're just like, get me the fuck out of here, like, uh,
yeah. So I went back home to Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I grew up,
right,
and I got involved in music stuff a lot, and eventually that ended up, there are other tendrils to my story there, but this led to me booking shows in various spaces, and then eventually, in my mid 20s, I started a venue.
right,
So we took a raw industrial space and like built it out in the middle of the winter, which was
right,
quite an adventure.
right.
And we started booking shows. We ran it for 3 years, and we had about an average of like 3 or 4 shows a week.
That's a
So it
lot.
was pretty much a full-time job.
Yeah,
And at the same
yeah. There's some
time,
good.
yeah.
I mean, Madison, I don't know what time that was, but I remember there was, what's that label? Like Night Tapes or something like that. What was that? Like, or, it was like weird experimental electronic music. And then, I mean, there's a bunch of rock bands, but there's a great music scene it's like
Yeah.
native to Madison,
Oh
basically,
yeah,
right?
it punches
Yeah.
way above its weight. Yeah.
Um, yeah, what is that? I'll like look it up and tell you later. But there was a label I remember following like super closely for a while that was just super strange and like very one of those things. It's like sort of like special time, special sound, like very unique thing.
You might
Um,
be talking about
uh,
the whole like, I can't remember the label's name, but it's like Burial Hex was one of the bands, and it was like a mixture of like folk and like noise and electronic and stuff.
Yeah, so there was that side of Madison, but then there was also this just like pure sort of like weird like synth experimentation, but they were like ex-punk people kind of experimenting with electronic music early on. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I'm not
uh,
sure which area you're talking about, but I would probably know most of those people, honestly.
yeah, yeah, so probably like I don't know, 2006 to 2010, kind of whatever, like in that.
Yeah, so you're talking about like probably like Problem Child, Samantha Glass, Golden Donna.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. Like, yeah, exactly. Samantha Glass for sure. But what? There was like a label all these people congregated around. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But yeah, that would have
yeah,
been the same world. But I mean, the interesting thing about it, I guess, is the only thing notable thing is that yeah, it had a reputation. I was living in New York at the time, and like I feel like that was like well known, like very like
yeah,
broadly known. Like, I mean, Madison, Wisconsin is no hard feelings, but isn't kind of it's not connected to many other things. It's like hard to get to or whatever. So. Uh, Probably a good time to be
yeah.
there, basically.
Yeah, no, a very good time to be there, and it's always been a very like fertile place for that. But as you said, it's also kind of an island. Like it's this
Yeah,
bizarre, like downtown Madison is almost this like, a 5 block slice of like I don't know the East Village or something like plunked on a
yeah,
lake, and it's like frozen. And yeah, like,
yeah.
um, and
Well, there's a
I
college
lived down
there.
there. Yeah,
Like a big part of it is a college, right? Like that's kind of like one of the draws. So, or like one of the causes of basically like there existing this kind of cultural whatever thing
it
going on.
is. It's also just like the city. Madison or Milwaukee are where you go if you're like a weird kid on a farm, and a lot of those
Yeah,
people just never leave.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting. That's kind of interesting though, because that's like yeah. So it has a good intersection of both like you import a bunch of like weird free thinking, probably you know um, drug eating kids, and then you also have like sort of more traditional like yeah the kids of farmers and so on who want to move to the city.
Yep.
I always feel like that's actually like a good combination. Or I feel like I grew up around a combination like that, and generally like that's a very like American thing that has lots of different permutations, but can be great. Uh, but anyway, so was the venue just it's like its company? Like, are there challenges like organizing the thing itself, or like
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. It was a it was basically a nonprofit kind of collective. There were at any given time about 5 people who were key holders and could like book stuff there and like had a financial stake in it.
yeah?
Um,
Did
it
you have to figure out all the governance? Like, did you do the? like who was in charge of actually running the sort of corporate governance, like actually organizing
Me,
the thing? And
me,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
No,
right.
I,
Well, there you go.
I,
Yeah,
I
that'll
started it. Yeah, it was definitely like BDFL. Like,
right, right.
um, and honestly, the governance was not hard. Like everyone
Yeah,
got along. Like it worked
yeah,
well.
yeah.
And we'd have fundraisers. At one point, we decided we wanted to do more, infrastructure build out in there, and so we just had a Kickstarter, and it went super fast, super well, super fast, and like people were into it.
Nice. That's cool. That's good. What was it called? Or do
It's
you
called the Vault.
nice. Okay, cool. That's cool.
Um, and we really had a large, gamut of stuff that was there. We had everything from, like death metal bands from like Mexico to like a professor of like medieval lute at the University of Chicago who came up and played like a recital there.
Excellent. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder what, I mean, I grew up going to like punk shows and then and then going to hip hop shows and going to see, techno and electronic music and whatever, like music venues have always been such important parts of, they're so important to like how I feel like contemporary culture sort of happens, both because of like it's a place for people to, you know, ex demonstrate what they're actually working on, but in this really rapid, quick way. Uh, and there's something interesting about that in COVID world where that's like completely gone. But there's also, I feel like, maybe I'm just getting too old, but I'm like, it feels like that's less of a thing, I think. Maybe I'm just like disconnected from it. But every time I try to kind of, you know, I'm a parent, I got plenty of stuff to work on. Like I'm not going out all the time, but every time I'm sort of like, oh, can I dip back into this in any way? It does seem like it's changed. So basically, like I don't find that venues like what you're describing exist as much as they did certainly when I was a kid. Like when I was a kid, the kind of like every town had the like all ages vegan whatever,
hmm
like place that punk shows happened, right? And I feel like then when I talk to kids, I'm like, is that a thing? That's such an important, or in my memory, is like such an important place where I don't know, a certain kind of like cultural energy took place, or I don't know. Uh,
To lead a little bit into the urban stuff, I do feel like Facebook and the porting over of all this organic, grassroots energy there onto social media did affect this.
yeah,
For one
maybe
thing, it's a lot more
that's interesting.
legible.
Yeah,
And the second thing though is that like I really hurt a lot of these like little music scenes because all of a sudden, little personal disputes get kind of made legible to the world, and
yeah,
then people can put political meaning on them, and like people in other towns who are really just bored and just have a prurient interest in like some drama will just get
yeah.
enveloped in it, and it was not positive. Like I saw that happen from when I was like in high school, and then I was a freshman in college when Facebook rolled out past, just like Harvard and stuff, and so
Yeah,
everyone's on it, and so the music scene got on it, and yeah, that was not positive.
that's interesting. Yeah, I tend to think that like there's something to, I don't know if this is actually completely true, but yeah, I find that like music, like it's actually an amazing time for music in general because the your ability to basically just produce and release something and build a community around it digitally is really rapid. Obviously, like there's a lot of like missing tools in terms of like just ownership and just like owning distribution just generally, like how artists actually, keep possession of the things that they make. And it's like, Bandcamp is cool. We can probably do a lot better than that. But Bandcamp alone is actually really cool in terms of the breadth of creative production that happens there. But yeah, maybe it's that it's just so diffuse now. It's like it used to be you had to have physical proximity for like a scene to happen, and now it's like a scene just happens between a bunch of different people who are so physically disparate and probably don't have the money to, like are never going to actually physically connect with one another. Um, but
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
true and not true, but I just mean at the scale of like, yeah, the local, like, hardcore club or whatever. Like,
I think about this through the lens of like legibility a lot. Like if you have something that where you actually have to spend the effort to like, find out about something and get involved with it, and it's not just
yeah,
all out there on Facebook for you to, contribute to or, spam or like talk shit if you're having a bad day, then you're
yeah,
more likely to preserve it and treat it with more care. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of ways.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that broadly, obviously. And I think, yeah, and obviously that's a lot of like what we try and make and work on, right? when I was trying to wolf the other day, we were doing the Palladium podcast, we were talking about it as kind of like, actually, we're talking about basically exactly this, that you like this kind of like bars and salons, like things that are all about friends of friends, but they're not broadly legible, are really valuable cultural spaces that just don't really exist on the internet. And you're right that basically all, even the, the Bandcamp, the deep, some very weird niche, SoundCloud, whatever rabbit hole you might find, it's still totally legible. It's like totally public. And so that like characterizes how it's going to feel, or like the kinds of things that people feel like they're allowed to do. Um, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's kind of like that never translated. It's kind of a weird thing. I don't know if everybody in the in that era, the 2000s, like had enough experience with those types of things, because no one seems to lament their disappearance that much. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing; it just is what it is. But anyway, all right. So you worked on this thing in like in Madison, but that was kind of a while ago. What causes it to like? Do you just decide, all right, I think it's over. It's time to move on?
No, we had a. This is actually a funny story. We had a. So it's really cold in the winter, right? And so we would have like a burn barrel outside, like a 55-gallon metal drum, and we'd have like
Yeah.
a little fire out in the parking lot, and uh, somebody got feisty and they stuffed a dried out formaldehyde soaked Christmas tree uh, into the burn barrel, and it caused a 60-foot flame to shoot into the air. And then some of the neighbors called the fire department,
Yeah.
and the fire department were like, okay, you say this is an art gallery. It's obviously not just an art gallery. You've got like
Yeah.
100 people in here.
Yeah.
There's a band. Like, shut it down.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. That's a common That's a common story. I feel like I've, I won't tell them, but I have plenty of stories of either being at places that were like that, not necessarily when they got shut down or shortly before, or even, yeah, hosting parties that probably should never have happened in spaces, the spaces that they were thrown in. That feels like a, yeah, normal thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like we did a pretty good job of like, people treated the space with respect,
Yeah.
99.9% of the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and then ironically, I had double booked, so that night I had been running a show at a different venue, and then I get all these calls like, someone
Right.
stuffed a tree in the burn barrel. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, that's kind of the amazing thing. I mean, most of these places just run on pure trust. Like that's actually
yep,
why they
yep,
work. It's just everybody trusts each other and takes care of the thing, and they want the thing to exist. So they generally are, try to be safe, basically, or try to take care of it,
yeah.
and yeah, keeps it from sort of falling apart.
And
But
then, honestly,
obviously,
like 3.5 years was a pretty good run. Like,
yeah, that was good at the time. Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
Well, so
I
what
wasn't
happens next? Or well, like, I guess I'm curious just to thread the needle back, right? It's like, okay, you're working on community organizations and nonprofits, and there are problems with those organizations. And this
right.
is something we have talked about quite a bit. But the thing I actually don't know is where that, um, uh, yeah, where you start. Like, is it that you accumulated this sense that like the system isn't working over a long period of time? And actually, it might be worth you even just articulating some of your own sort of
Sure.
criticisms of it. And it could be we could give the background on what we were thinking with Urbit.org and where it is now too. Um,
Sure. So simultaneously, while this music stuff was going on, there was another massive project in my life, which was that I had been living off and on in a housing co-op in Madison, and Madison has a large system of these, and about half of them are in a network together, and I lived in one of those, and we also had music stuff there, and we had all kinds of community events there, and it was very much like a happening place and a cool place to live if you're into that kind of stuff and try to be plugged in. And in 2013, the house that I lived in caught on fire. I wasn't actually there. I was off on the East Coast seeing my friend get married, but there was a fire, and we're not really sure how it started. It was probably like a firework or like someone throwing a cigarette from a different building, and then we just varnished our deck, and
yeah.
did a bunch of damage. My brother actually pulled the fire alarm. He like saw it late at night. But in the aftermath of that, we had this big battle within the organization about whether to rebuild the house or not. And and this took like 2.5 years to actually get the house rebuilt, because there were these countervailing pressures within the organization of like, what is this for? Like, is this for the members that exist right now, or is this like a social service organization that has this larger social mission? out
Interesting.
there. And that's really where I clarified a lot of my thinking about this stuff, because I feel like there should be a clear distinction there. They're like, I'm all for there being charities and social service organizations and so forth out in the world, but when you try to define something that was, in the bylaws designed to benefit the members, the people who live, in these houses, and then say, well, actually, we should cash out, we should sell this instead of rebuilding and giving these same people a home. We should cash out and like put this towards the idea was that they wanted to then go buy more buildings that would get more bang for their buck and like increase the footprint and basically be able to
But
house
wait,
more people.
did that, this is, sorry, like I'm like, need to know whether this, how much of a break from the original thing. Like, was it that this is a collective that owns one house, and now all of a sudden they're like, no, 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 we're going to become a major landlord in
So
Madison?
not quite. They own 10
Okay.
houses.
Okay, okay,
Um,
okay, okay.
but this was the biggest one, and it's
Yeah,
like right downtown, and it's so
yeah,
the real estate is valuable. And
yeah,
so the idea was, despite that our mission says we're supposed to provide housing for students and whoever downtown, we should be more of a social service organization. And the plan was basically to go like buy these like disused, apartment buildings in the edge of town and make it more of like a charity, like supported housing type of thing, and you'd be
yeah,
able to house more people.
yeah,
And we're like, well, that's all well and good, but that's not our purpose as an organization,
yeah,
and that's not in the bylaws. And
yeah,
also, we have these people who've been living in this house. Most of them are low income. Like they deserve to like still live downtown. Like don't just put just punt them to
yeah,
the edge of town. Like just so you can put 20 more people in a building.
yeah,
Um, and the governance problems that ensued out of that were really nasty,
yeah,
and there was a lot of discrepancies between what does it say in our bylaws and what does the state law actually mandate for like how you are supposed to run the internal governance of a nonprofit organization.
yeah.
And it took a lot of legal time and a lot of just head scratching and a lot of dispute within the organization to figure that out. And really it was a slog.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, so as a takeaway, I feel like one of the things that took me a long time to understand, even almost like as a designer, is that like when you run into a problem like that, it's sort of like that problem is presupposed, much further somewhere. It's like somewhere back in the history of whatever the thing is. The
yeah.
mistake was made a long time ago. It's actually an unfixable thing at that point, basically. I mean, maybe through, but it takes an enormous amount of input of energy to basically try and correct something that's so that has existed for like a
Yeah.
really, really long time.
So that's precisely what happened. Basically, I was on the board of directors, and we had to have. It probably took about a year and a lot of legal bills to rewrite our bylaws and rewrite
Right,
our organizational codes essentially to
right,
make all of our decision-making processes be, conforming to the legal standard.
right. Wait, to like, you mean, wait, what do you mean exactly by that? Yeah, like by the legal
Well,
standard,
there
like,
are there are there are laws that detail how a registered nonprofit corporation in the state of Wisconsin is supposed to run, in
yeah,
terms of like, are you a membership corporation? Are you a shareholder corporation? Who gets
yeah,
to vote? How are the votes conducted?
right.
So there are official rules in a lot of detail for that, but the rules that we had slowly built up over the years based on
Yeah, yeah, we're not
one
compliant,
situation or
basically.
another, we're not in concordance with that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay, so yeah, I can see like, okay, well, okay, so but is your takeaway? So one thing we talked about a lot at the beginning of, so when we met, yes, Tlon was, and so, okay, so for a bit of context for those who don't know, right? Like, um, Urbit starts as an experimental project. There's always this address space. The idea is that the company owns half of that address space when it gets incorporated in 2013. We give away a lot of it to developers, of course, because we want this thing to grow. And then we've sort of earmarked a good chunk of our address space. And Curtis originally earmarked a lot of his address space to go to a future foundation in the spirit of Linux Foundation, Mozilla Foundation. There aren't a lot of good examples of software foundation, but those are reasonable ones. But the thinking on how that was going to be done is not always completely clear. I think that, I mean, it's pretty obvious in a way when you think about the fact that basically, like, Urbit should be neutral shared infrastructure. Tlon as a company will grow to have its own concerns in terms of basically how we make money providing services. And there needs to be sort of a set aside pool of assets to basically just fund platform development exclusively as these things start to diverge. So when we met, we were already thinking a lot about this, which is basically like, okay, we have this big pool of assets that already it's worth something, and we want to entrust it to some institution that can care for it for a really long time. It could be a really long time. I mean, let's think about it on the order of 100 years, just to clarify our thinking, I guess, or it was like how I was originally trying to think about it. And so we had, like most things with Urbit, tried to think about this problem from first principles. And we're not like, yeah, we didn't, it's address space, it's magic internet numbers, it's not like, or it's cryptographic assets, it's not it's not existing property, and we're not direct, while we would, there's certain like regulatory constraints in terms of like how you want to structure this thing to be as tax advantaged as possible and so on. We don't have, we have a lot of freedom, basically. And so when we first started talking, we talked about all these different sort of institutional structures that could potentially work or could get around some of the issues around. You've kind of like, well, sorry, I'm getting distracted.
You're muted. Galen, you're muted.
Okay, this should work again. See if yeah, it does work again. Can you hear me? You should be able to hear me. I like the one moment that I'm talking about the problems with streaming is the moment that
You're good
everything
now.
falls apart. Oh, okay, it came back. Okay, good. Anyway, what I'm looking at is like 4 different instances of the stream, YouTube, Google Meet, and OBS all running at once. It's like extremely distracting. Uh, anyway, sorry, picking up on the last thread, basically we were thinking about all these different um, uh, institutional structures that could care for these assets and distribute them, in accordance with, we want these to be, used for platform development, basically. And one thing that we talked a lot about was like, okay, well, how do you basically like correctly incentivize a human institution to just, remain committed to that goal? Because saying committed to that goal, actually important caveat, it's like I may be personally committed to that goal, but one of the most important things about, spinning out an independent entity is that it actually has to be independent. So it cannot be, I couldn't be involved, and some of the people who are deeply involved in Tlon really shouldn't be directly involved in any independent foundations. It's an interesting problem, right? Like how do you create a mandate or sort of recurring mandate? So we came up with a few different things. Maybe we can talk about them. But I wonder whether is there anything by the time we're having that conversation, is this the sort of primary? Because you were saying this was happening in 2013. I think we probably met in 2018, 2017, 2018, something like that.
Right. So the whole situation with that basically mostly resolved around 2016,
Okay.
because it took 2.5 years to actually get the house rebuilt, and for all of that time there was this dispute within the organization that goes into dimensions upon dimensions, that was largely became not so much about the house as it was about the governance structures of the organization and how we fix them and original intent versus the current demands and like what's the purpose of the organization. And so that stuff is all percolating in my brain and really has been ever since,
Yeah.
because you have this organization that was started in the 70s and certainly had its ups and downs, but at some point it hits this crisis mode now where it's very difficult to govern, and it's very difficult to kind of get people on the same page about, even to agree how it should be governed. And so yeah, it was definitely still in my mind at that point, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, I guess my question is more like, did you have other? Well, I have there are two questions. One of them is like, are there other things that happened like after that that were where you feel like you were able to sort of improve on that situation?
Uh, I wasn't really active in community stuff after that. No, I
Okay,
was
okay,
like,
got it.
I I left California about in the fall, or sorry, I left Wisconsin in the fall of 2016.
Yeah,
Moved to California, and
yeah,
I spent a couple of years basically working on my book
yeah,
and reading a lot, including on some of these dynamics within
yeah,
organizations. And then I got really into kind of like super, institutional longevity stuff.
yeah, yeah.
And maybe this is a good time to talk about the about my favorite novel that I won't shut up about
Well,
frequently.
well, so that's actually, yeah, that was kind of my other question is like, well, there are two parts to it in a way. It's like my thinking has always been that it's like you should be able to judge an institution and potentially its longevity based on almost like this simplicity and straightforwardness of its governing rules. So it's really important that those and like those rules like are its mission, right? So one of the things you notice a lot is that like so, it's actually particularly hilarious with sort of like technology platforms where you're like, don't be evil. Well, we run all the servers. We're a totally centralized corporation. And you're like, okay, well, I mean, it doesn't matter how much you don't want to be evil because you have the opportunity to be evil, right? Um, uh, so I wonder whether, but it's well, so it's hard to generate examples, I think, of institutions that basically don't suffer from either some innate schizophrenia or the ability to drift because their rule set is too flexible and it's too easy for them to rewrite it over time. So I wonder whether you think that's true, and then I guess I also wonder whether you have, yeah, if you do you, is it that you have a theory or that you actually have examples also of things that have worked?
Right. Okay. So yeah. First of all, this is like a hard problem. This is like a really hard problem, and anyone who says they have like some foolproof answer for more than 2 years is like fooling you.
Yeah. I think it's
Uh,
even it's like a deceptively hard problem. That's actually what's interesting about it is because
yeah.
everyone thinks they've solved it. And the funny thing is that no, if you look at most of the evidence about it, and this is something I definitely learned looking at this foundation problem, is that no one had solved it. Especially it's particularly egregious in crypto, where like everyone says they've solved it and it's obviously not going to work. And there are also plenty of examples of things completely already falling apart in the short term, and we're like, whatever, 9 months into something. Um,
Yeah.
but anyway, yeah, go ahead. Not to,
No, it's super hard. And the more assets you have attached to it, the harder it is, and the more power and like social connections you have attached to it, the harder it is. And maybe the worst possible case is something where you have a lot of assets that will appreciate in the future. So,
yeah,
you see these crazy struggles among organizations that have like valuable urban real estate, for example, that they bought, 100, 200 years ago, and now we have this this financialization and this asset bubble for
yeah,
precisely that
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
uh, Crypto is just that, on a speed run in many
yeah.
ways. So
You're
that
reminding me like
said,
I watched this happen at Cooper. So like where I went to school is a I mean we could this is a rabbit hole we could potentially dive down later, but like the sort of institutional decay of Cooper happened right as I was there, which is an institution that benefits from basically land grants or what I mean donations of real estate in Manhattan that have these enormously valuable recurring leases. So that's like the way that the endowment renews itself. It's like every time the Chrysler building renews its lease, which who knows how many hundreds of $1 million that's worth, or who knows, it's certainly millions of dollars. Um, but how that is actually, how that gets used, it turns out that the rules around that are pretty loose, and that's really problematic, especially if it's an institution that's supposed to run for hundreds of years. Anyway, keep going.
so yeah, so while I think there's an immense value in doing what we did with the co-op, which is bringing your bylaws and your internal governing structures into greater concordance with something external, a legal system that has standard definitions and and some sort of reliable social contract and reliable judgments. You can make a similar analogy about technical protocols and putting Urban on a blockchain, etc. Uh,
Yeah,
I think that's all really valuable, and I think that like many people, there's an early failure case that many people hit, which is simply being too utopian and like too hippie and not doing that.
yeah,
Um, but there are, but that's not really the main failure case for institutions that go for a couple hundred years and then falter. Um, I mean, sometimes it is. Sometimes the legal system just breaks down, and you're the university of wherever, and there's a dictatorship installed, and like, what are you really going to do? Um, on a deeper level, though, I think that it comes back to good leadership, but it also comes back to this question of legibility. Like, is it too easy for people to just like automatically join your institution, your organization, and have outsized power in ways that they can easily transfer to outside contexts. And this is the challenge of our time because this is what legibility and globalization and the erasing of like different social stacks and different stacks of social status really bring about, because it's far too easy to just convert your local privileges and your local standing into something global and then take it wherever. Um,
Wait, so okay,
it,
let's dig into this a little bit so we make sure it's, or even just so I make sure I understand. So, is the argument that, let me see if I can give an example. Like, you're saying that if I, you know, the incentive is such that even if I'm a member of my local community board, there's no way I don't want to get elected to be, on the board of city supervisors, and then to become, and then to start end up on, cable news or something like that. There's all that people are sort of consistently. I don't know whether, like culturally incentivized to kind of keep climbing that ladder, and so that causes you then to like ignore the problems at hand with whatever like
yeah,
scale you're working on. Okay,
I would even say that
that's
electoral politics is not a bad example, but it's even worse when it comes to things that are a little bit more squishy. Academia, foundations, media,
right.
cultural settings. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean it's a
but the
not. There's like,
mechanism
yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
the mechanism that you've identified is absolutely correct, though, which is that it's because we have cable news, you can turn your standing on a local community board into something larger. It's not really about you serving your community; it's about you having access to the spotlight, and you having access to networking with people who have basically all achieved some level similar to you of like prominence and again access. And so your, the thing you can reach for is right there now. Uh, and again, this is all much worse when it comes to more, squishy, amorphous institutions.
Doesn't it? I mean, it's hard for me to. It seems like what you're saying boils down to the fact that like all of those steps up are also like you're just literally incentivized to take them. Like you're going to either make more money or sort of be more famous and therefore make more money. It's like you're climbing. Is it the people are you're not necessarily arguing against that system, but is part of this being sort of an acc. Is this situation accidental because people are simply trying to accumulate more resources, or is it that there's something flawed in these individual small scale institutions? Is it that they're like not taking care of the people who commit themselves to them or something, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah. So I think that a lot of human nature hasn't changed. Like this isn't, people are suddenly more ambitious or like they want to convert this stuff more, but I think it's easier for them to do so. I think that the risk calculus that they take when they do this stuff is it's much less risky now. Like it used to be okay, so you could maybe rise to the top of this little heap, and then but you don't have instant communication, you don't have this credentialist paradigm where you can just go apply that credential somewhere else. It's more like, okay, so you rose to the top of this little heap, you're a leader in this particular
oh,
area, and you
okay,
stay there.
okay, yeah, got it. This is actually almost like it's more similar to saying, or the way I'm reading it is more like because it's almost the same. Or let's see if I can draw this connection. It's like it's almost like likes driven social media or something. It's like everyone starts to it's a gradient descent towards the takes that get the most impressions or something. It's like you're as you uh, you know as you gain in power, like you're naturally you're rewarded for doing things that are either like more visible or attract more attention or attract more goodwill, and so you're just kind of like naturally going to go out. It's almost just like a sort of serotonin loop where you just keep going and you can't stop yourself. Do you think that's kind of like you're saying or sorry, and you're saying that that's made worse by people just have like by everything being legible to everything else. So because you're sort of always on a public stage, people are always looking at you're even as a local community organizer, you can potentially immediately sort of go viral or what, have what you did on your slow street becomes a thing for the whole world or whatever, then, it like
Yeah.
changes the dynamic of like what that, yeah, yeah, like
Well,
everybody's a
let's put
public
this really
figure.
let's put this really like clearly even in a social media sense. Let's say that you're a local news anchor. Okay, so you get a blue check on Twitter and you get like 10,000 followers on Twitter because you're talking to people in your community on TV every night about like what happened. There's a crime report and there's a feel good human interest story and people tune in. Well, okay, so now you're a blue check on Twitter and you've got 10,000 followers and you can go participate in conversations with people who are not in your community but who are also blue checks on Twitter, and now you're a member of that tribe.
Right. And
And
then you have to succeed in that tribe and so on. You're kind of like,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the internet is a terrible, terrible mistake.
and I think there's something to be said about like legibility and context here, because you are your status there is immediately clear to anyone who sees that kind of like leaderboard of
Right,
like you have this blue check, you have this many followers, you're
right, right,
participating in
right,
these conversations.
right. And so
Whereas in the
that,
past, yeah,
well, then it's like the character of what you're talking about becomes more. It's like its context necessarily gets broad, has to get broader. You're
yeah,
speaking to like a more, well, you're not talking to your community anymore. You're talking to all of these people, and because you're participating in a conversation that is legible to all of these people, and
yeah,
that,
and your status,
yeah,
yeah, and your status and your
yeah,
legitimacy becomes more about the people who are on your level rather than derived from what you do for your community and what you
yeah, yeah,
the yeah.
yeah. That's like, yeah. I mean, as an aside, I feel like this argument could be compressed a little bit in a way that's probably be good. Not that this is it's a good conversation, but I'm wondering like, I'm like, yeah, this is interesting because it's not just arguing that like sort of like, in the Center for Humane Tech way, like algorithms are bad and they kind of, yeah, do this gradient descent thing where we all think the same thing. It's a little bit different because it's like, it's almost the inverse of that way of looking at it, which is to say that when people in very localized contexts get connected to these global networks that are structured in such a way, they are naturally they naturally like abandon that context and move outwards towards like a totally connected narrative, and that's
Right.
risky or something to that effect. Yeah.
Because I mean, this well predates social media. This is like the modern story in many ways. You know,
Yeah.
and status eligibility is basically what makes small scale social environments bearable. It's like the idea that
Yeah.
you have a higher status in one little stack, and someone else has a higher status in another stack, but you can't easily make an equivalency between them.
Yeah.
Venkatesh Rao talks about this a lot in some of his essays on Ribbon Farm, and that's
Okay.
where
Sure.
it kind of crystallized for me. But
Well,
now,
so anyway, you were yeah, or maybe you're about to
yeah,
do this, but I'm like, okay, okay, I get the criticism, and I get that that's actually a pretty. It makes sense also to me that it takes some time after the experience in Madison to kind of like crystallize like this is a sort of generalized point about the this sort of localized incident or something. But, I mean, lots of other things happen, but anyway, it sounds like you were thinking or you're thinking arrived at some form of a solution or at least the outlines of one maybe or something like. Is that what you were gonna?
yeah, yeah.
Well,
And
let's
basically that
yeah, let's hear it. Sorry, go
uh,
ahead.
uh, and basically you have to, if you want a value, if you want some values or some principles to be like, present in the future or present in the context that you want to inhabit, and they're not in the technology or the framework or the governing bodies that are actually gonna like determine what that looks like, you'd better invent them. And in this case, legibility or illegibility has been drained out of all of our local communities and our local institutions and cliques and scenes and so forth. And so we better put it back, because really I think that Rao is right that like it's completely unbearable when everything is measured in the number of likes and like the monetized emissions of your your thoughts, your blogs, whatever. Like there has to be a way to have some kind of privacy and some kind of illegibility for like, no, this is the thing I'm in, and it's not counted in likes or micropayments or whatever. And this is this is what I'm into, and it can't be measured so precisely.
Yeah, I wonder whether that's interesting, and I agree. But I also, the thing that I think about a lot is that, like, when you were going to, or like, being a part of a small scene as a kid, like, what you wanted was to, work it up the chain, basically, naturally. Like, we naturally want broader visibility, right? And so it's interesting when I think about it just purely culturally, I'm like, is it cool? Like, is it cool to be illegible? Do you know what I mean? Like, does it become, I mean, I think it kind of,
I
that's
think
what
it's
you're in a
required
way are. Yeah.
because I think that like you know being for most people, the ability to be cool, the ability to achieve something and feel like they've achieved it is coming from the fact that like not everything is legible. Like you may not be a movie star, you may not be at the very top of your chain, but you have value in your community, and your accomplishments and your leadership have value in your community, and people value for that you for that. But if everything is so like glaringly obvious, legible, that goes away.
Well, so yeah, no, I'm saying I agree with you in principle, or like I agree at a high level that makes sense, but I'm thinking about it sort of from the first person perspective. Like, does is it, we live in a world where I think it's very difficult to make the choice to be illegible. It's actually like harder to do. You have to make
Yeah.
this weird choice to not live in public. And it's just literally harder to do, just like from a user interface standpoint. Like, how do I do that? I don't know. I have to try to do that. Um, but I wonder whether, and I mean, I think this is just like, this is the, and so sure, like Urbit tries to make it incredibly easy for you to create your own sphere of illegibility or something. But it's interesting to think about how that also is positioned as something that is, it can't just be, or I'm always skeptical of, and I'm not, of basically it being like the eat organic approach, Like on the one hand, I really like that. It's like,
Right.
no, actually, it's like, it's more, if you want to sort of live well, be illegible, right? And that's
I
like,
don't think
but
that's
it's not,
yeah.
yeah, but it's not,
Yeah.
it feels a little condescending or something, it's like, people don't like those kinds of things. They don't,
They don't want to eat
I
their
don't,
vegetables.
yeah, no one wants to eat their vegetables, but like, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, you
Yeah,
see what
no,
I'm saying?
so I completely agree with that, and I think that you know the value proposition here is not, it's not on the face of it, oh, you'll be more illegible for
Actually,
this
sorry.
reason.
What's funny about this is that doing this as a public thing, it's like that maybe this is the last one that we ever do. Because it's like, wait a minute, why are we making this legible? Right? Like, why make this a public? I was like, oh, you should, maybe people don't understand what we do. And I'm like, you know what? Actually, maybe it's better that people don't understand what we do or what the culture of the people who work here is, because it's like a secret and that's okay. So, anyway, sorry. uh,
Well, we just cut off the feed right now.
yeah, you just ended, just pull the plug. Uh,
Um,
anyway, sorry.
but
Go ahead.
but I mean, I think there's a lot of other dimensions in which this is valuable to ordinary people who want to create something. Um, and I don't think this is a matter of eating your vegetables at all. I think it's about having control over, your own community and your own like content and so forth.
Yeah. I think that feels really good. So it's like actually maybe going back all the way to the, the thing that's really cool about like local music venues and stuff is that, and especially even, yeah, if you're involved in either whether you're performing or operating them or whatever it might be, like the experience of being involved in something that is very sort of site specific, community specific, whether you're tailoring it or just being there, always feels good. And so, sure, like the availability of being able uh, to both create those spaces, go to those places digitally is definitely like you want to think about it in that, yeah, sort of from the positive, I think, like from the standpoint of, oh, this would be a great thing to be able to do, or you want to be able to do it because it's unique. Um, not necessarily because it's illegible, because it's specific, I guess is another way to put it.
But also, I mean, keep in mind that like this isn't purely like this isn't purely a positive thing in terms of like, oh, if this is more legible, I can like rise out of here. I think most people like they want to know their friends and their neighbors. They want to participate in
Yeah,
something that actually has some kind of like
yeah,
boundary
yeah. The
conditions.
way to really ascend is to ascend into like you're only with whatever the eight other people or something. It's like it actually goes the other way around. It's like you're going into smaller and smaller, more specific sort of spheres of communication or something. Um, but wait, how does this impact like basically community governance or how community institutions are formed and survive? Is it just are you just saying like the important thing is that they control their own sort of rule set and they can tailor it specifically for themselves? Like how does that work over time?
Right. So yeah. So I mean, I think it's important that you have a that you have a rule set that is simultaneously like has some checks and balances in the outside world on something you depend on in the worst failure case, so that you're you sufficiently understand how that connects to the legal system and various governance rules. But then on the internal side, I think it's also important to be sufficiently in control of your own culture. That's a squishy word, I'm aware. Uh, to the point where you're not just open to the world. Like you're not just one more instantiation of whatever cultural winds tend to blow in. um,
Yeah, but do you think you
and
can sort of enshrine that in from a governance standpoint? That seems like one of the hardest things to actually make into like some form of how do
well,
you formalize that?
I think that the difficulty of becoming a member of this stuff is the way you formalize it.
Okay, yeah,
um,
that's interesting.
and the difficulty in becoming especially a leader or a senior person as enshrined in that. I don't really have any really good answers about like how you would do that, but in general, you can actually look at some different cases of political organizations that have open membership. There's the famous case that the British Labour Party had this massive upset, I think about like 8 years ago or so, when the Jeremy Corbyn partisans stormed into the Labour Party and got him elected party leader and then subsequently prime minister, because they had an open party sign up rule, and
Mm.
people took advantage of that. And I believe that they had changed that because they were worried about declining numbers. Don't quote me on that, but they changed this, and all of a sudden there was what they call entryism. And so, and I think that entryism is really interesting to look at in all kinds of contexts that aren't just nakedly political, because it's basically a gamble that you can get, that any new blood is good. You need to staff your organization. You need to have put people in the membership roles, and you're gambling that outweighs the course changes that would happen very potentially if you invite a bunch of new people in.
Well, most of the time, like if you're vying for political or social power, more bodies usually is desirable, right? Like you're just looking for like um, or I feel like the kind of normative way of thinking about it is like the more people that are involved, the better, and that yeah, qualifying that or putting a high barrier to entry is means that then per person, each person has to sort of like exert themselves that much harder effectively in order to
Yeah.
you know but I think for what you're if there's a kind of shared cultural value that like an institution is not meant to be giant, and that it wields its power in some other fashion, or that it's kind of intends to stretch its, intends to live as long as possible, then a smaller membership can make
So
obvious sense, basically.
yeah. So actually, you've hit on something that is one of the key reasons why I got so enthused about Urbit in the first place, believe it or not, which is that I'm all in favor of, I think you've hit on something essential, is like many organizations that need to remain small, somewhat illegible, somewhat difficult to enter in order to preserve their actual purpose, their actual mission. And the more the outside world gets, legible in terms of status and very transitory in terms you can take this credential, this social media follower count, etc., from place to place, and we become very fluid in that way. That becomes harder. At the same time, you'll hear this critique from a lot of people, particularly on the left, and they have a point, which is that you know this is bad if it's just the total hoarding of opportunity or the total hoarding of resources. If it's simultaneously, every institution closes its doors and it's also hard to create a new institution, then that's the grounds for inequality. And so what I like about Urbit in this very like small scale digital sense is you can be as exclusive as you want, but you're not hoarding anything. You're not keeping anyone from starting their own group. And, forking is painless. It's frictionless. It just happens. You get a planet, you host it, you have a group. Um,
Yeah.
and honestly, I wish the physical world was more like that, because I come down squarely in the position of there should be, like, exclusivity is not bad. It's how people preserve any kind of character. At the same time, when you exclude people and prevent them from building stuff for whatever reason, that's when you get bad societal effects, and that's when people have a legitimate grievance that they can't express their own character.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it ultimately comes down to it's like has to do with, you know, making sure the tools are evenly distributed. So certainly like, the urban approach is to say we want everybody to have a toolkit for constructing their own whatever it might be, whether it's building their own software, figuring out what they want to do with the platform, or simply, yeah, building their own communication tools, or just customizing their own environment with some group of people. And that toolkit should be, is there's no barrier to entry and to get that toolkit and put it to good use. And in fact, it's like, I think of it like it's our job mostly just to make that toolkit easy to understand and use. Um, and yeah, towards the end of, you have this great diversity of, and sort of archipelago of, or whatever, different communities with relatively, and each of which can basically, yeah, decide their own barrier to entry, because that's not, those rules should be decided by the individual members. The thing that we get criticized for, that I think is fair, but I don't have a good solve for, and I think it actually is probably for the better, has to do with, well, like, who gets to decide what those tools are and how do they work? And so, like, like making core, like making contributions to the kernel is hard. Changing the kernel is hard. And actually, like, how that software gets distributed is decided on by not that many people, and there's a very formalized system by which it gets distributed. I think that keeping that barrier to entry high is probably part of what then ultimately will result in relatively a very high quality thing that everybody can use. But there's, and actually I would argue that if you look at anything of that nature, even whether it's a product or whether it's an institution that provides some affordance to the public, like, they almost always have to have very strict rule set and have a relatively high barrier to entry. But it's interesting because they're kind of like in opposition to one another. It's like, well, what we give you should be very open and you should be able to repurpose it. But like, we can't really just, and you can fork that tool set. You can do whatever you want. You could fork the whole network. You can go do, I mean, certainly it's like built in the spirit of open source, but on the other hand, it's like, it's actually, there's like both an organizational structure and kind of like a community structure to it. I think we have the balance mostly right, actually, but it's kind of interesting that there are like kind of intention, I think. I think in a
Well,
good way,
absolutely.
but yeah. Uh,
Well, absolutely, and I would say that, like, I think a lot of the solution there is for people to build kind of like third-party like on-ramps. Like, maybe there's going to be a no-code, tool that allows you to like play with elements of Urbit software in a way that doesn't demand as much
yeah,
technical knowledge. Or to put a completely different analogy, it's like, okay, so I almost feel like, SAT prep for, for college admissions is kind of like this. It's like, you can say, okay, we're gonna, like, there's a school system that's failing. Like, are we going to target our money to like fix the whole school system, or are we going to, like, help people like get better test scores so they can get into a better college? And like that's the paradox of this thing is like, do you want people to understand all the material, or are you making a value judgment that if they learn enough kind of like meta knowledge and hacks that they can get something that would benefit them? Like, you won't be able to build with as much fluidity if you only use a no code system, but you'll be
Sure.
able to do some things. You'll be able to go to college by just going to an SAT prep, cram school on the weekend, but you might not get as much out of college as if you'd actually had a good holistic high school education.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, well, all right. So yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that there's kind of like there's always going to be this gradient of, I'm trying to like sort of reformulate this or simplify it, but I'm not sure that I can. But I think it's basically just that, yeah, there's this kind of gradient from, you know, things that are, I mean, for a system to provide a specific outcome, it's like you have to kind of guard the people who create that, like that the people who create that system or
Mm-hmm.
the institution that governs that system has to be relatively closed. And the more closed, the more specific and sort of polished that it can be. And the more open, the more, I mean, it's, yeah, I don't know if it's that simple actually. I'm just going to abandon this one halfway through. But I mean, I think like, I mean, the interesting thing that you're getting at, or like the interesting arc, and this is kind of why I think we like originally got along well and like we're enjoyed working on the foundation stuff. Obviously, you're doing different stuff now, but is that I think that it's like a slightly counterintuitive take that basically like yeah, the way to build a long-term institution is basically to figure out how to sort of make sure that it is its barrier to entry is high in a way that does not feel unfair or make it so
Mm-hmm.
illegible that it isn't accountable. And I think that's it's like it borders on something that can be sort of dangerous or not good, but is actually, I think, yeah, is well reasoned and makes sense. Um, so yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's
because
like
it's a pressure release. Like if people think that XYZ system is the only game in town in a like zero sum way, they're going to devote all of their very natural human instincts and talents to gaining access to that, whether or not the things they want to do within that system or that institution are the things that it was designed to do in the first place. And this, I think, is a massive problem today in that we have all these legacy institutions. A lot of them date from the World War II New Deal era. A lot of the other ones date from the 60s and 70s. And we've given them institutional backing and mandates. And, if you work for one of them, you get good health insurance, you get a good pension. We have a credentialist system. And many of them don't do what they say on the box anymore. Uh, they whether it's education or healthcare or the military or these Fortune 500 companies, they're really fallen victim to Goodhart's law, and they are self-perpetuating, status and patronage machines in many ways, and they don't produce what they said they were going to. And this isn't just purely some story about human venality and greed and ossification. It's also what's happening outside of those things. Like, where's the pressure release? And if there isn't much of one, then of course people are going to obey rational incentives and head into these things and colonize them for their own personal or community benefit.
but what do you mean exactly by pressure release? You mean like you're saying like if these things aren't functioning properly and there's some sense that they like internally that they aren't functioning properly, there's no alternative. You mean almost like it's like there's nowhere for that internal discontent to productively move?
I wouldn't even say internal discontent. I would say discontent in general, because that would let people start stuff before they even try to join those organizations. Like,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
if you look at
Yeah.
like, crony capitalism or like
Yeah.
regulatory capture,
Yeah.
let's say, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This is like, I mean, this is a pervasive, like, um, I mean, I remember, in like probably 2010 having conversations with people where I'm like, this is, the internet is completely fucked and useless and it's headed, just forget it. And people are like, well, what should I do instead? And you're like, fine, fair. It's
I
like,
remember,
it,
so Yeah.
It's just like you should make the argument in practice. Like if you can't make the argument in practice, it's basically uninteresting. So
Hmm.
so like sure, like okay, there's institutional decay, but can you like how do you combat that? Well, you should give people the toolkit to explore what's possible with their own institutions, and then you might
Yeah.
see alternatives emerge. Which is actually yeah, definitely like I feel like we should just almost like, oh, we'll just wrap it up. We're kind of at time anyway, but that's a good concluding thing. Because I do think one of the things that's interesting about Urbit and talking about Urbit publicly is that I'm very stubbornly sort of show don't tell. And this feels like one of the sort of core parts of the ethos of this project, which is just like, it's not about the argument. It's not interest. The argument is not interesting as an argument. The thing is interesting if it works and if it's like if it's as you describe a pressure release or basically something that can that people can put to work and you can see the fruits of that. You know, they can use it and what they use it for is what's interesting. And so it's like the argument on its own is not is kind of like you know, you have to think through this stuff, but ultimately the question is like, well, yeah, if you gave the people the toolkit to sort of explore what's possible in their own institutions, to take ownership of those rules,
Hmm.
would it work? It's actually kind of an unknown question, right? Or I don't think the interesting thing about this is I feel like you were going to say, no, here's how you do it. And what you're actually saying, I think, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, is more like, well, you should at least give people the ability to take ownership of these tools, create their own institutions, and then kind of like, we'll see, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because a lot of it's not that like, oh, we know that this is going to succeed or fail. It's that like people feel constrained.
yeah.
Like they don't have the possibility space.
Yeah, right. And it seems like there's so much more that's possible, but in order for them to explore what's possible, you kind of, yeah, there's a lot of like foundational stuff that's missing. Um, well, this is fun.
Yeah.
Can try and enshrine that as a, you know, I don't know. There's some core principle here that needs further refinement.
I hope you didn't
Uh,
make anything too legible.
I
Let
know,
any of
I
the
know,
secrets
that's
out.
so funny. I'm just like, fuck, we should stop this now. uh, yeah, just you can think of this
No,
as
it's
like
great.
the argument in itself is a tool for other people to use. Anyway, yeah, thanks, man. This is fun. Uh,
Cool.
all right,
See everybody.
later, guys.